Michael Sullivan had built his dream home in Pine Valley Estates long before any homeowners association existed in the area. For over 3 decades, his Mediterranean-style villa, with its distinctive terracotta roof and sprawling gardens, stood as a testament to architectural freedom and personal property rights. What he never expected was that a group of power-hungry HOA board members would try to claim authority over his privately owned property, demanding he completely redesign his home to match their approved aesthetic guidelines. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, or that their illegal power grab would lead to their complete destruction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Michael's meticulously maintained garden as he stood on his front porch, coffee in hand, surveying the property he'd poured his heart and soul into since 1990. Back then, Pine Valley had been nothing more than scattered custom homes on large lots, each one unique, each one a reflection of its owner's personal vision. He'd chosen this spot specifically because it had no restrictions, no HOA, to dictate what he could or couldn't do with his own land. He'd watched over the years as development crept closer, the empty lots around him gradually filled with newer homes, most of them built by Sunrise Development Corporation. Unlike his distinctive villa, these houses followed a strict cookie-cutter pattern. Identical beige stucco facades, standardized brown roofs, and carefully regulated yard designs. In 2010, these newer homeowners had formed the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association, but Michael's property had always remained independent, a fact he'd made crystal clear whenever they'd tried to recruit him. "Your house really stands out," they'd say, not quite masking their disapproval. "Wouldn't you like to be part of our community standards?" Michael would always respond the same way, with a polite but firm reminder that his property predated their association and would remain independent. For years, that had been enough. But things changed when Rebecca Hamilton took over as HOA president. Unlike her predecessors, who had merely expressed disapproval of Michael's unique home, Hamilton saw his independence as a direct challenge to her authority. The first hints of trouble came in the form of friendly letters suggesting his home was affecting property values. Then came the not-so-friendly complaints about his gardens being too exotic for the neighborhood aesthetic. Michael had ignored it all. His property rights were legally sound, and he knew it. Or at least he thought he did, until that fateful morning when he opened his mailbox to find a certified letter that would ignite a war for property rights that would shake Pine Valley Estates to its very foundation. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead and signed by Hamilton herself, claimed that due to recent municipal zoning changes, his property had been incorporated into the HOA's jurisdiction. According to their interpretation, he was now subject to all HOA regulations and had 60 days to bring his home into compliance, which meant completely repainting his beloved villa in their approved beige color scheme, replacing his terracotta roof with their standard brown shingles, and removing his Mediterranean gardens in favor of their approved landscaping package. The letter concluded with a threat. Failure to comply would result in daily fines of $500, and the HOA would place a lien on his property if necessary. They had included an itemized list of his current violations, totaling over $15,000 in fines already assessed. Michael's hands shook as he read the letter, not from fear, but from a deep, burning anger. He'd spent years as a successful commercial real estate developer before retiring, and he knew exactly what this was, a calculated attempt to bully him into submission or force him to sell. They thought they could use legal intimidation to strip away his property rights, to erase 30 years of history and personal investment. They picked the wrong person to try this with, he muttered, walking back into his home office. He hadn't spent 4 decades in real estate without learning a thing or two about property law and without making some very useful connections. It was time to remind this HOA board that property rights weren't just words on paper. They were fundamental rights worth fighting for. Picking up his phone, Michael dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Diana, it's Michael Sullivan. Remember that favor you owe me? I think it's time to cash it in. How'd you like to help me take down a corrupt HOA board?" Diana Chen's law office occupied the entire top floor of a sleek downtown building, a far cry from the modest workspace where Michael had first met her 20 years ago. Back then, she'd been a rookie lawyer helping him navigate a complex commercial development deal. Now, she was one of the state's most respected property rights attorneys, known for taking on and winning cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. "So they're claiming jurisdiction through municipal zoning changes?" Diana asked, examining the HOA letter through her reading glasses. The late afternoon sun, streaming through her office windows, cast long shadows across the conference table where they sat. "Have you seen these supposed changes?" Michael shook his head. "That's just it. I've been checking the city's public records. There's no record of any recent zoning adjustments in Pine Valley Estates, nothing that would suddenly give an HOA authority over a pre-existing independent property." Diana's eyes narrowed as she reached for her laptop. "Let me show you something interesting," she said, pulling up a database. "In the past 5 years, I've handled 3 similar cases in different counties. HOAs attempting to forcibly incorporate independent properties through questionable legal means. All 3 cases had one thing in common: Sunrise Development Corporation." Michael leaned forward. "The same company that built all the newer homes in Pine Valley?" "Exactly," Diana nodded, turning the laptop so he could see. "They have a pattern. They build new developments around existing properties, establish HOAs, then gradually try to absorb the independent homes, sometimes through pressure, sometimes through dubious legal claims. Most people either give in or sell out because they can't afford to fight." She pulled out another document from her files. "But here's where it gets really interesting. Your HOA President Rebecca Hamilton, she's married to James Hamilton, who happens to be Sunrise Development's Regional Director of Acquisitions." Michael's jaw tightened. "So this isn't just about community aesthetics or property values. They're trying to force me out so Sunrise can acquire my land." "Most likely," Diana agreed. "Your property sits right in the middle of their development. Having an independent Mediterranean villa in the center of their cookie-cutter community probably drives them crazy. But more importantly, if they could acquire your land, they could potentially subdivide it into 3 or 4 lots. Michael did the math in his head. In Pine Valley's current market, that could mean millions in potential profit for Sunrise Development. No wonder they were playing hardball. "Here's the good news," Diana continued, closing her laptop. "Their entire claim rests on these supposed zoning changes. If they can't produce documentation, and we both know they can't, their jurisdiction claim falls apart. The bad news? They're not going to back down easily. This is about more than just your house now. If they lose this fight, it could set a precedent that would affect their ability to pull this same trick elsewhere." Michael sat back in his chair, processing the information. "So what's our next move?" Diana smiled, the kind of smile that had made her reputation as a lawyer you didn't want to face in court. "First, we demand to see the official documentation of these zoning changes. Give them 48 hours to produce it. When they can't, we file a cease and desist order. But that's just the beginning. I want to dig deeper into Sunrise Development's connection to the HOA board. If Rebecca Hamilton has been using her position as HOA president to benefit her husband's company, that's a serious conflict of interest." She pulled out a legal pad and began writing. "We'll also need to document everything, every interaction, every letter, every attempt they make to enforce their non-existent authority. And Michael, they're going to try to provoke you. They'll send inspectors, issue more fines, maybe even try to put a lien on your property. Document it all, but don't engage directly. Let them dig their own grave." Michael nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He'd spent his career developing properties, understanding the complex web of zoning laws and property rights. Now, it was time to use that knowledge to protect not just his home, but potentially help others who might face similar battles. "One more thing," Diana added, her expression serious. "Be careful. When people with power start to lose it, they can become desperate. I wouldn't put it past them to try some underhanded tactics." As if on cue, Michael's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his neighbor, warning him that HOA inspectors were at his property right now, taking photos and measurements of his house. The battle was already escalating. "Well," Michael said, standing up and straightening his jacket, "shall we give them something to really take pictures of?" When Michael pulled into his circular driveway, he found exactly what he'd expected. 3 people in matching Pine Valley HOA polo shirts, clustered around his front garden with tablets and measuring tools. Their matching beige SUV, emblazoned with the HOA logo, was parked at the curb, notably just over the property line onto his land. Leading the group was Tyler Matthews, the HOA's head compliance officer, a man whose dedication to enforcing arbitrary rules bordered on zealotry. Michael had crossed paths with him before at community meetings, where Matthews had repeatedly tried to convince him to voluntarily join the association. Now Matthews stood there with a smug smile, photographing Michael's prized Italian cypress. "Trees. Afternoon, folks," Michael called out, stepping from his car. "Enjoying the view?" Matthews turned, tablet in hand. "Mr. Sullivan, perfect timing. We're conducting a mandatory property inspection as per Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws." "Mandatory?" Michael replied, keeping his voice casual despite his rising anger. "That's interesting, considering I'm not part of your HOA. You're currently trespassing on private property." The 2 younger inspectors exchanged uncertain glances, but Matthews's smile only widened. "Actually, Mr. Sullivan, as per the recent municipal zoning adjustment and our notice to you, your property now falls under HOA jurisdiction. We're well within our rights to conduct this inspection." Michael pulled out his phone, opened the camera app, and started recording. "Please show me the official documentation of these zoning changes you keep referencing." Matthew's smile faltered slightly. "The documentation was included in your notice packet." "No," Michael corrected him. "The notice packet contained a letter claiming such changes existed. I'm asking to see the actual municipal documentation. You do have that, don't you? Since you're using it as the basis for trespassing on my property." The younger inspectors took a step back, but Matthews stood his ground. "Mr. Sullivan, if you continue to obstruct an official HOA inspection, we'll have no choice but to add non-compliance fees to your existing violations." Michael walked closer, phone still recording. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Matthews. You have exactly 30 seconds to get off my property. After that, I'm calling the police to report trespassing. And trust me, they'll be very interested in hearing about how you're fraudulently claiming authority over private property." "This is your final warning," Matthews snapped, his friendly facade cracking. "The board has authorized me to begin immediate enforcement actions. Your non-standard architectural elements are in direct violation of 10 seconds, Michael interrupted, already dialing 911 on his other phone. "And by the way, you might want to move your vehicle. It's parked on my property line, which means I can have it towed at your expense." Finally, the younger inspectors had had enough. They quickly gathered their measuring tools and headed for the SUV. Matthews stood alone now, his face reddening with anger and embarrassment. "This isn't over, Sullivan," he growled, backing away. "The board has unanimously voted to take action. You can't fight an entire HOA. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "Watch me," Michael replied calmly, still recording as Matthews retreated to the vehicle. As they drove away, he noticed several neighbors watching from their windows and porches. Good. Let them see how to stand up to bullies. Inside his home office, Michael immediately downloaded the video and sent it to Diana. His phone rang less than 5 minutes later. "This is perfect," Diana said without preamble. "They just handed us exactly what we needed." Not only did Matthews admit they can't produce the zoning documentation, but he threatened you with fraudulent fines while trespassing. "I'm filing for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning." Michael sat down at his desk, pulling up his own files. "I did some digging after our meeting. Guess who approved Matthews's hiring as compliance officer? Rebecca Hamilton, about 2 months after her husband's company bought the empty lot next. "To mine, the one they can't develop because it's too small to meet municipal requirements unless they could combine it with part of my property," Michael finished. "The pieces are starting to fit together." Diana's voice turned serious. "They're going to retaliate for this, you know. Standing up to them so publicly, they'll try to make an example of you." Michael looked out his office window at the property he'd spent 30 years perfecting. His gazebo, where he'd hosted countless family gatherings, the garden his late wife had designed, the unique architectural details they'd chosen together. No HOA board, no development company, no amount of threats or fines would make him give that up. "Let them try," he said firmly. "I've got the law on my side, and more importantly, I've got the truth. Time to show them what happens when they mess with the wrong homeowner." "Speaking of truth," Diana added, "I think it's time we started sharing some of that with your neighbors. How many other homeowners has this board bullied into submission? How many have been hit with suspicious fines or forced to make expensive changes? Something tells me you're not the only victim here. You're just the first one to fight back." Diana's suggestion about involving the neighbors proved more fruitful than either of them had anticipated. The morning after the confrontation with Matthews, Michael's doorbell rang. Standing on his porch was Sarah Martinez, a retired accountant who lived 3 doors down. She clutched a thick manila envelope in her hands and kept glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I saw what happened yesterday," she said quietly, as Michael invited her in, "and I think there's something you need to see." Inside his kitchen, Sarah spread out dozens of documents across his granite countertop. Financial records, board meeting minutes, and enforcement actions spanning the last 3 years. As a former HOA board treasurer before Rebecca Hamilton's takeover, Sarah had kept copies of everything, including documents that had mysteriously disappeared from official records. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to a series of enforcement actions. "Every time Sunrise Development shows interest in a property, the HOA suddenly finds multiple violations. The fines keep mounting until the homeowner either makes expensive modifications or sells, usually to one of Sunrise's subsidiary companies." Michael studied the documents, his jaw tightening. "And no one's challenged this?" Sarah shook her head. "Most people can't afford to fight. The legal fees alone would bankrupt them, and those who consider it, well, look at this." She pulled out a particular set of minutes. "The board has a legal defense fund, over $500,000, set aside specifically to outlast any homeowner who tries to challenge them in court." "Where did that money come from?" Michael asked, already suspecting the answer. "That's the interesting part," Sarah replied, pulling out more financial records. The fund grew dramatically after Rebecca Hamilton became president. The board raised HOA dues by 40%, claiming infrastructure improvements, but most of that money went straight to the legal fund. And look who handles the account: Hamilton Financial Services. Let me guess, owned by James Hamilton's family. Sarah nodded. His brother runs it. They're earning significant interest on that money while it sits there, threatening anyone who might oppose them. Michael took photos of every document, immediately sending them to Diana. His phone buzzed with her response. This changes everything. We need to talk. Bringing someone with me. 2 hours later, Diana arrived with Marcus Rodriguez, a senior investigator from the State Attorney General's office. As they sat in Michael's living room, Marcus reviewed the documents with growing interest. We've been monitoring Sunrise Development's activities across 3 states, he explained. This pattern you've uncovered here in Pine Valley matches complaints we've received elsewhere, but this is the first time we've seen such detailed documentation. The HOA is just a tool for them, isn't it? Michael asked. A way to force people out of their properties? Marcus nodded. Their typical strategy is to gain control of HOA boards, then use increasingly aggressive enforcement to either devalue properties for purchase or force owners to sell. But they're usually careful to maintain plausible deniability. These documents, though, he held up the financial records. This creates a direct paper trail. So what's our next move? Michael asked. Diana leaned forward. We go on offense. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing not just for an injunction against their enforcement actions, but a RICO suit against Sunrise Development, the HOA board, and all involved parties. RICO? Sarah asked, looking confused. Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, Marcus explained. It's typically used against organized crime, but it applies to any organized group engaging in patterns of fraudulent activity. The penalties are severe, including triple damages. But we need to move fast, Diana added. Once we file, they'll try to destroy evidence. That's why Marcus is here. The AG's office can issue preservation orders for all HOA and Sunrise Development records. Michael's phone suddenly chimed with multiple notifications. Opening his neighborhood's community Facebook page, he found dozens of new posts. The HOA had just announced an emergency assessment, an additional $5,000 per household, due within 30 days for unforeseen legal expenses. They're trying to build up their war chest, Sarah said, reading over his shoulder. Most families here can't afford that kind of surprise expense. They won't have to pay it, Marcus stated firmly. I'm calling a judge right now for an emergency. Order freezing the HOA's accounts. We can't let them extort more money from homeowners to fight this battle. As Marcus stepped outside to make his call, Michael noticed more neighbors gathering on the street. Word was spreading fast about the emergency assessment, and people were angry. Some were heading toward his house, probably drawn by Diana's distinctive car in the driveway. I think it's time to hold a community meeting, Michael said, watching the growing crowd. These people deserve to know what's really been happening in their neighborhood. Diana smiled. Perfect timing. Nothing scares corrupt officials more than an informed community ready to fight back. Want to see something interesting? She pulled up a news article on her tablet. 3 other Sunrise Development communities in the state have already reached out to my office. Looks like Pine Valley isn't the only place where homeowners are ready to take a stand. By sunset, Michael's spacious living room had transformed into an impromptu town hall. Over 40 neighbors packed the space, with more standing in the foyer and spilling onto the front porch. The emergency assessment had struck a nerve, but it was the rumors of corruption that had really drawn the crowd. Diana and Marcus sat at Michael's dining room table, now converted into a makeshift legal desk, while Sarah organized her documents on the kitchen counter. They've been systematically targeting specific properties, Michael explained to the gathered crowd, pointing to a large map of Pine Valley estates projected on his wall. Red dots marked properties that had faced unusual enforcement actions. The pattern was unmistakable. They clustered around areas where Sunrise Development had shown interest in expansion. Last month, they fined me $7,500 for my children's treehouse, said Tom Watson, a software engineer from Oak Street, said it violated height restrictions. When I couldn't pay, they suggested I consider Sunrise Development's voluntary purchase program. Similar stories poured out. Linda Chen had been fined for her garden's non-conforming rose varieties, just weeks after refusing an offer from Sunrise. The Patels faced violations for their traditional Diwali decorations, which had never been an issue before Hamilton took over the board. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation. "Here's what you need to know," Diana addressed the group, her voice carrying authority. "The HOA's attempt to claim jurisdiction over non-member properties, like Michael's, is completely illegal. Their enforcement actions against existing members have frequently exceeded their authority, and most importantly, we have evidence suggesting these actions were coordinated with Sunrise Development for their financial benefit." "But what about the emergency assessment?" asked Carol Thompson, a retired teacher. "They're threatening liens. If we don't pay by month's end," Marcus stepped forward. "As of 2 hours ago, a state judge has frozen the HOA's accounts pending investigation. They cannot collect any new assessments or enforce any fines until this matter is resolved." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, but it was short-lived. Blue and red lights suddenly flashed through the windows as 2 police cars pulled up outside. Through the front window, Michael could see Rebecca Hamilton stepping out of her luxury SUV, accompanied by Tyler Matthews and 2 uniformed officers. "Right on schedule," Diana muttered, gathering specific documents. "Everyone stay calm. This is just an intimidation tactic." The doorbell rang, and Michael answered to find Hamilton wearing her most official expression. "Mr. Sullivan, you're hosting an unauthorized gathering in violation of HOA bylaws regarding home occupancy and parking restrictions. These officers are here to—" "These officers," Diana interrupted, stepping forward with her credentials, "should be very interested in this court order freezing HOA assets and activities pending a criminal investigation." She handed copies to the officers. "Additionally, as this is now part of an active state attorney general investigation, any attempt to interfere could be considered obstruction of justice." The officers reviewed the documents while Hamilton's face reddened. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "You can't just—" "Actually, Mrs. Hamilton," Marcus said, joining them at the door and showing his state credentials, "we can, and we have. In fact, I'd strongly advise you to contact your attorney. The AG's office will have some questions about your husband's involvement with Sunrise Development's property acquisitions." One of the officers looked up from the court order. "Ma'am, this appears to be a valid judicial freeze on HOA activities. We can't enforce any HOA regulations until this is resolved." Hamilton's composed facade cracked. "This is your fault," she hissed at Michael. "You have no idea what you're doing. The board has resources you couldn't imagine. We'll bury you in legal fees." "Actually," Sarah called out from behind Michael, where she'd been quietly recording the entire interaction on her phone, "I think the state attorney general might be interested in that threat, especially combined with the financial records showing HOA funds being diverted to your family's investment firm." Hamilton's face went pale. For the first time, real fear flashed in her eyes as she looked at the crowd of neighbors gathered behind Michael, neighbors who were recording everything on their phones, neighbors who had finally had enough of her tactics. "This meeting is over," she snapped, turning on her heel. But everyone could hear the tremor in her voice. Her power was slipping, and she knew it. As the police cars and Hamilton's SUV pulled away, Michael turned back to his neighbors. The mood had shifted. Fear and uncertainty had been replaced by something stronger, determination. These weren't just individual homeowners anymore. They were a community united against corruption. "So," Michael addressed the group, "who's ready to take back their neighborhood?" The response was unanimous. Pine Valley Estates would never be the same, and that was exactly what they wanted. The next morning brought Pine Valley Estates residents an unwelcome surprise. Despite the court order freezing HOA activities, every mailbox contained an urgent notice from the board. Michael received his copy from Sarah Martinez, who'd started coordinating communication between neighbors after the previous night's meeting. "They're trying to get ahead of the story," Sarah explained, handing him the letter, "and they're not being subtle about it. The notice, printed on official HOA letterhead, painted a very different picture of recent events. It described Michael as a belligerent, non-conforming homeowner who was endangering property values through frivolous legal action. The letter went on to claim that the state investigation was baseless harassment and that the board was taking all necessary steps to protect the community's interests. "Look at this part," Sarah pointed to the second page. "They're calling for an emergency board election next week. They want to reinforce the community's support for current leadership. Before the investigation proceeds." Michael's phone rang. It was Diana. "Tell me you've seen this morning's letter," she said without preamble. "Just reading it now. They're scrambling." "More than scrambling," Diana replied. "They're in full panic mode. My contact at the AG's office says they served search warrants at Sunrise Development's regional office this morning. They found documents being shredded. James Hamilton apparently spent the night there after our meeting." Michael smiled grimly. "Not fast enough, I'm guessing. The AG's digital forensics team is reconstructing everything. But here's what you need to know. Hamilton's calling in reinforcements. Their parent company, National Community Developers, is sending their chief counsel and a crisis management team. They'll be at the emergency board meeting next week. They're bringing in the big guns," Michael mused. "Exactly. They can't afford to let this spread to other communities. If Pine Valley homeowners successfully challenge their tactics, it could spark similar resistance across the country. They're going to try to end this quickly, probably with a show of overwhelming legal force at the board meeting." Michael watched through his window as more neighbors collected their mail, gathering in small groups to discuss the letter. "So what's our move?" "We need to be ready for that meeting," Diana said. "I'm bringing in additional counsel, specialists in real estate law and corporate fraud. But more importantly, we need those homeowners organized and prepared. The board's going to try to intimidate them into submission. We can't let that happen." A knock at Michael's door interrupted their conversation. It was Tom Watson, looking worried. "Michael, you need to see this." Following Tom outside, Michael found 3 large construction vehicles parked along the street bordering his property. Workers in Sunrise Development uniforms were unloading surveying equipment. "What's going on here?" Michael called out to the crew supervisor. The man consulted his tablet. "Preliminary survey work for lot assessment. We have authorization from the HOA board to evaluate all border properties for potential infrastructure improvements." "On whose property?" Michael asked, already knowing the answer. "The survey area includes a 10-foot buffer zone on all adjacent properties to the planned development zone," the supervisor replied, clearly reciting from a script. "You mean my property," Michael stated flatly, "which isn't under HOA jurisdiction and which you have no permission to survey." The supervisor shrugged. "Take it up with the board. We're just doing our job." Michael pulled out his phone and dialed Diana, putting her on speaker. "You're on with Michael Sullivan and his attorney," he announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "Please explain your legal authority to conduct surveys on private property without owner consent." The supervisor's confident demeanor faltered. Diana's voice rang out clearly. "Any unauthorized entry onto my client's property will result in immediate legal action for trespassing. Additionally, as this appears to be an attempt to circumvent the court's freeze on HOA activities, I'll be notifying the judge immediately." The supervisor spoke quickly into his radio, and within minutes the crews were packing up their equipment. But the message was clear. The HOA and Sunrise Development weren't going to back down easily. Back inside, Michael found several text messages from neighbors reporting similar survey attempts around other non-conforming properties. Hamilton was testing their resolve, seeing who would stand firm and who would fold under pressure. "Time to call another meeting," Sarah suggested, reviewing the reports on her tablet. "But this time, let's do it officially. The HOA bylaws allow for emergency community forums if enough homeowners request one. We have more than enough signatures after last night." Michael nodded. "Set it up. Before their emergency board meeting, let's show them exactly what they're up against. An entire community that's done being bullied. And Michael," Diana added, still on speaker, "wear a suit to this one. When they bring their corporate lawyers, I want them to see they're not dealing with just another angry homeowner. You're a successful developer who knows exactly what game they're playing and knows how to beat them at it." The Pine Valley Community Center buzzed with energy as residents filed in for the emergency forum. Michael stood at the entrance with Sarah and Diana, watching as nearly 200 homeowners filled the seats. They'd chosen this venue carefully, neutral ground, but also a powerful visual reminder that this was bigger than just one homeowner's. "A fight. Rebecca Hamilton just pulled up," Sarah murmured, checking her phone. "Looks like she brought reinforcements." Indeed, Hamilton strode through the door, flanked by an imposing group. James Hamilton, looking considerably less polished than usual, Tyler Matthews, and 4 people in expensive suits who could only be the corporate legal team from National. Community developers. They took seats in the front row, openly surveying the crowd. "Those 2 on the left," Diana whispered to Michael. "I recognize them. Richard Blackwood and Maria Torres. They're notorious for handling community resistance issues for development companies. They specialize in making problems disappear." Michael straightened his tie. Charcoal grey suit, crisp white shirt, the same outfit he'd worn to close million-dollar deals in his development days. "Then let's give them a problem they can't make disappear." The forum began with Sarah presenting the documented pattern of targeted enforcement actions. She'd created a detailed timeline, projecting it on the wall for everyone to see. Dates of violation notices matched perfectly with Sunrise Development's property acquisition attempts. In the past 18 months, Sarah concluded, properties targeted for potential acquisition received an average of 3.5 times more violation notices than other homes. The average fine amount was 2.8 times higher. And in every case, whether homeowner sold, Sunrise Development or one of its subsidiaries was the buyer. One of the corporate lawyers, Blackwood, stood up. "This is speculation and coincidence. The board has a duty to maintain community standards. If certain properties required more enforcement, like my rose garden," Linda Chen interrupted from the audience. "The same roses that won community awards before Mrs. Hamilton became president. The same roses that suddenly violated guidelines right after I refused to sell to Sunrise." More voices joined in. The Patels described how their Diwali decorations were deemed violations despite being specifically protected by state law. Tom Watson detailed the suspicious timing of his treehouse violations. Each story added to the pattern, and Michael could see the corporate lawyers exchanging concerned glances. Then Maria Torres, the other lead lawyer, tried a different approach. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's be realistic. Property values in Pine Valley estates depend on maintaining consistent community standards. Mr. Sullivan's Mediterranean villa, while unique, affects the marketability of surrounding properties. The board has a fiduciary duty." "Actually," Michael interrupted, stepping forward, "let's talk about property values." He nodded to Sarah, who switched to a new presentation. "These are real estate trends for Pine Valley and surrounding communities over the past 5 years. Notice anything interesting?" The graphs told a clear story. Property values in Pine Valley had increased more slowly than comparable neighborhoods, despite the area's booming market. But here's where it gets fascinating. Michael continued. When you remove properties acquired by Sunrise Development and its subsidiaries, the pattern changes. The next slide showed a dramatic difference. Properties sold to Sunrise went for an average of 22% below market value, always after periods of intensive HOA enforcement actions. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Michael pressed on. As a former developer myself, I recognize this strategy. Create artificial pressure on property values, force distress sales, then flip the properties for profit. The HOA isn't protecting property values. They're deliberately suppressing them to benefit Sunrise Development. Rebecca Hamilton shot to her feet. This is absurd. We've maintained the highest standards, like the standards that led to these. Diana stepped forward, distributing packets to the crowd. These are copies of emails between Mrs. Hamilton and Sunrise Development executives discussing which properties to target for compliance enhancement. Emails that were recovered from the shredded documents at Sunrise's office. The corporate lawyers huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. James Hamilton's face had gone pale. His wife's carefully maintained composure was cracking. "There's more," Diana announced. "The State Attorney General's office has uncovered similar patterns in other communities where Sunrise Development operates. This isn't isolated to Pine Valley. It's a systematic strategy of using HOA regulations as weapons for property acquisition." The room erupted in angry discussions. Michael watched as homeowners who had once been intimidated into silence found their voices, sharing their own stories, comparing experiences. The corporate lawyers were now frantically typing on their phones, while Rebecca Hamilton sat rigid in her chair, her expression a mask of fury and fear. "This community forum," Michael addressed the crowd, "is just the beginning. Next week's board meeting isn't about reinforcing their authority, it's about holding them accountable. They thought they could divide us, intimidate us one by one. They were wrong." The applause was thunderous, even as Rebecca Hamilton and her entourage hurried out of the community center. Michael could see the shift in the room. Fear had been replaced by determination. Individual grievances had become a unified cause. The real battle was just beginning. The morning after the community forum, Michael woke to the sound of heavy machinery. The noise came from the vacant lot next to his property, the one owned by Sunrise Development. Through his bedroom window, he could see construction equipment moving into position, including a large excavator that was being positioned suspiciously close to his property line. His phone rang almost immediately. It was Tom Watson, who had a clear view of the activity from his second-floor home office. "Michael, they're setting up some kind of construction barrier. There's no permit posted, and they're definitely overlapping onto your land." Michael was already dressed and heading outside when Diana called. "Don't engage directly," she warned. "They're trying to provoke a reaction. I'm calling the city inspector's office right now." But when Michael reached his side yard, he found something even more concerning. The construction crew had erected temporary fencing that cut several feet into his property, blocking access to his garden irrigation controls. A man in a Sunrise Development hard hat was supervising the placement of heavy equipment right along the disputed boundary. "Excuse me," Michael called out, keeping his phone camera recording. "You're on private property." The supervisor turned, revealing a familiar face. David Hamilton, James Hamilton's other brother, the one who ran the family's financial services firm. "Actually," he smiled, "we're conducting authorized site preparation for approved development. Your property line is in dispute." "In dispute," Michael repeated. "Based on what?" "Our surveys indicate inconsistencies in the original property boundaries," David replied, pulling out a set of documents. "We've filed for an emergency assessment with the City Planning Commission. Until this is resolved, we're proceeding with our approved development plan." Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Diana. "Don't sign anything. City inspector on the way. Keep recording." David Hamilton continued, his voice carrying just enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. Of course, we're open to an expedited resolution. Our legal team has prepared a settlement offer that would resolve all pending issues, including the property line dispute and any outstanding HOA matters. He held out an envelope, but Michael kept his hands firmly on his phone, still recording. Any communications can go through my attorney. Think carefully, Mr. Sullivan. David's smile turned cold. This offer expires at noon. After that, well, construction delays due to property disputes can be very costly for everyone involved. More neighbors had gathered at the edges of their yards, many with phones out, recording everything. Sarah Martinez was already documenting the equipment positions and taking measurements from the property markers she'd helped Michael document the previous week. Then, something unexpected happened. Linda Chen stepped forward from the growing crowd of neighbors. "Mr. Hamilton," she called out clearly, "would this be similar to the property line dispute your company created with my elderly neighbors, the Andersons, last year? The one that forced them to sell their home of 40 years? David's composure flickered slightly. Before he could respond, Tom Watson joined in. Or maybe it's like the surveying error that coincidentally affected every homeowner who opposed your brother's development plans in the Oak Ridge community. One by one, neighbors began sharing similar stories, not just from Pine Valley, but from other communities where Sunrise Development had operated. David Hamilton's confident smile had vanished entirely, replaced by barely contained anger. "This is private business between Sunrise Development and Mr. Sullivan," he snapped. "Anyone interfering with our authorized construction activities will face legal consequences." "Actually," a new voice cut in, "all construction activities need to cease immediately." A city building inspector had arrived, accompanied by 2 police officers. "We have no record of an approved permit for this work, and the property line dispute you mentioned, no such filing exists with the Planning Commission." The inspector turned to David Hamilton. "Furthermore, your company's development rights in this area are currently under review due to the ongoing State Attorney General investigation. I'm issuing a stop work order, effective immediately." David Hamilton's face reddened as he was handed the official notice. The police officers began documenting the equipment positions and property line encroachment, while neighbors continued recording everything on their phones. "This isn't over, Sullivan," David hissed as he stormed past Michael toward his luxury SUV. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. My family built this community, and we can tear it down just as easily." "No, Mr. Hamilton," Michael replied calmly, still recording. "This community was built by the people who live here, and we're done letting your family treat it like your personal monopoly board." As the construction crews began reluctantly moving their equipment, Sarah approached Michael with her tablet. "The settlement offer they wanted you to sign," she said quietly. "I got a glimpse of it when he was waving it around. It included a clause requiring you to withdraw all claims and evidence from the State Attorney General's investigation." Michael nodded grimly. "They're getting desperate. The question is, what else are they willing to do to protect their scheme?" Diana's voice came through his phone's speaker. "Whatever it is, we'll be ready. But Michael, watch your back. When people like the Hamiltons start losing control, they tend to take it very personally." "Excuse me," Michael called out, keeping his phone camera recording. "You're on private property." The failed construction gambit had backfired spectacularly on the Hamiltons, but Michael knew better than to celebrate too early. As he sat in Diana's office the next morning, surrounded by stacks of documents, the true scope of the family's operation was becoming clear. "Look at this," Marcus Rodriguez said, spreading out a series of property records across Diana's conference table. The State Attorney General investigator had been working through the night, connecting dots from the recovered Sunrise Development documents. "The pattern goes back almost 15 years. The Hamiltons didn't just build Pine Valley. They've been systematically taking control of communities across 3 states. Diana leaned in, studying the records. It's like a real estate version of a pyramid scheme. They build the initial development, establish the HOA, then use it to force out independent homeowners and redevelop their properties at a profit. But here's where it gets interesting, Marcus continued, pulling up digital records on his laptop. Remember that legal defense fund they set up? It's not just for fighting homeowners. They've been using it to lobby for changes in local zoning. Laws, making it easier to consolidate properties for redevelopment. Michael's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. He read it aloud. Emergency notice just went out. HOA board calling for a vote of confidence in current leadership. Meeting scheduled for tomorrow night. They're moving faster than we expected, Diana frowned. They must know we're close to something big. Just then, Marcus's laptop pinged with a new email. His eyes widened as he read it. You're not going to believe this. One of our forensic accountants just found something in the recovered files. The Hamiltons haven't just been using the HOA to target properties. They've been using it to launder money from their other developments. He turned the laptop around, showing complex financial diagrams. They've been cycling funds through multiple HOA accounts, mixing legitimate dues with development profits, then running it all through their financial services company. It's brilliant, in a completely illegal way. HOA accounts don't get the same scrutiny as normal business transactions. That's why they were so desperate to maintain control, Michael realized. This isn't just about Pine Valley. If one HOA breaks free, it could unravel their entire operation. Diana was already dialing her phone. We need to get a judge to expand the account freeze. Not just Pine Valley's HOA, but all their related entities. But before she could complete the call, Michael's phone rang. It was Tom Watson, and he sounded panicked. Michael, you need to see this. They're at your house. Who's at my house? City Code Enforcement. They're posting some kind of violation notice. Rebecca Hamilton is with them. Diana immediately grabbed her keys. Don't let them touch anything. We're on our way. The drive to Pine Valley took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When they arrived, they found a scene of calculated chaos. 2 city vehicles were parked in Michael's driveway, their official presence lending authority to what was clearly another Hamilton scheme. Rebecca Hamilton stood supervising as workers posted large red notices on Michael's front door and garage. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, kept back by Tyler Matthews and another HOA board member. What's going on here? Diana demanded, striding forward with Michael and Marcus. Rebecca Hamilton's smile was pure venom. The city has declared this property structurally unsafe due to unauthorized modifications. It's being condemned pending full inspection and remediation. What? Unauthorized modifications, Michael challenged. Our records show no approved permits for your Mediterranean architectural elements, a city inspector replied, consulting his clipboard. Without proper structural verification, the property must be vacated within 48 hours. Diana stepped forward. I'm Mr. Sullivan's attorney. Please show me these records. The inspector hesitated, glancing at Rebecca Hamilton. Marcus seized the moment, pulling out his state credentials. As this property is part of an active state Attorney General investigation, I'm going to need to see those records as well, including information on who initiated this inspection request. A new voice joined the confrontation. I can answer that. Everyone turned to see Linda Chen approaching with her tablet. Because I work in the city records office, and I just pulled the complete history of this property. She held up her tablet showing official documentation. Every modification was fully permitted and inspected. In fact, it was certified as a model of architectural compliance just last year. The inspector's professional demeanor cracked. But Mrs. Hamilton provided documentation showing falsified documentation, Linda interrupted, which, as a city official, You failed to verify before posting a condemnation notice. I've already notified the department head, who's on his way here now." The color drained from Rebecca Hamilton's face. Caught in another provable lie, with state officials present, she had finally overplayed her hand. "Mrs. Hamilton," Marcus said quietly, "I believe it's time we had a formal discussion about your creative approach to documentation, both here and in your HOA activities." The gathered neighbors watched as Rebecca Hamilton's carefully constructed authority crumbled. The inspector was already removing the condemnation notices, apologizing profusely, but Michael barely noticed. His attention was on his phone, where an email had just arrived from an unexpected source, James Hamilton's personal assistant, with the subject line that read, "What you need to know about tomorrow's board meeting." The email from James Hamilton's assistant, Jessica Parker, contained a bombshell. Michael sat in his study with Diana and Marcus, reading through the attached documents, while Sarah coordinated with neighbors by phone. "I can't stay silent anymore," Jessica's email began. "What the Hamiltons are planning for tomorrow's board meeting goes beyond their usual tactics. They're preparing to use the community's own emergency powers against itself." The attached files revealed a carefully orchestrated plan. The Hamiltons had arranged for a group of fake homeowners, employees of various Hamilton family businesses, to attend the meeting with recently backdated property records. "They're planning to stack the vote," Diana said, reviewing the documents. "These fake homeowners would give them enough numbers to push through any measure they want, even with the real residents opposing them." Marcus was already making calls to verify the information. "The property transfers are legitimate on paper, but they're all shell transactions. The Hamiltons transferred partial ownership rights to their employees just last week, backdating the documents to make them appear as long-term residents." "But why go to all this trouble?" Sarah asked through the speakerphone. "The state investigation is already underway. They can't hide their previous actions." Because of this, Michael pointed to the last attachment, a draft resolution for tomorrow's meeting. "They're not trying to hide anything. They're planning to dissolve the entire HOA and transfer all its powers to a new community management corporation owned by the Hamilton family." Diana's eyes widened as she read the document. "This is incredibly bold. By dissolving the HOA, they think they can void all the pending investigations, since the original entity would no longer exist. Meanwhile, the new corporation would have even broader powers over the community. And look who's listed as the corporation's legal counsel," Marcus added grimly. "Blackwood and Torres. The same lawyers who specialize in making problems disappear for development companies." Michael's phone buzzed with another text from Jessica. "Be careful. James doesn't know I'm sharing this, but I've watched them destroy too many communities. The meeting tomorrow. They're bringing private security. They're expecting resistance." Sarah's voice came through the speaker. "I've been tracking RSVPs for the meeting. Unusually high number of registrations from people I've never seen in the community before. Matches what Jessica's warning us about." "We need to counter this," Michael said, standing up and pacing his study. "They're not just trying to maintain control anymore. They're attempting a complete takeover." Diana was already drafting legal documents on her laptop. "I'm requesting an emergency injunction to block any structural changes to the HOA during the ongoing investigation. But we need to assume the judge might not rule in time." "Then we fight this on their terms," Michael replied. "Sarah, how many confirmed legitimate homeowners do we have?" 173 have pledged to attend, all verified residents. "And how many of these fake transfers did the Hamiltons arrange?" Marcus consulted the documents. 42 properties with dubious ownership transfers in the past week. Michael smiled for the first time that evening. "Then we've got them. Jessica's warning gives us the advantage. We can challenge every suspicious transfer before any vote takes place." Better yet, Diana added, attempting to manipulate a community vote with fraudulent residents during an active state investigation. That's not just civil fraud anymore. Marcus, your team can arrest them on the spot. The group worked late into the night, preparing their counter-strategy. Linda Chen provided official property records for every legitimate resident. Tom Watson, with his software background, created a secure digital voting system that required multiple forms of identity verification. The Patels, who ran a local printing company, prepared information packets exposing the Hamilton scheme for every attendee. "One more thing," Michael said as they finalized their plans. "Jessica's risking her career by helping us. We need to protect her." Marcus nodded. "Already handled. The AG's office has officially registered her as a confidential informant. She'll be fully protected under whistleblower statutes." As midnight approached, Michael stood at his window, looking out over his property, the home he'd built, the gardens he'd created, the community he'd grown to love. Tomorrow would decide not just his fate, but the future of every family in Pine Valley Estates. His phone buzzed one final time that night, another message from Jessica. Just overheard James on the phone with Rebecca. She's furious about today's failed condemnation attempt. They're moving all their assets to offshore accounts. Whatever happens tomorrow, they're preparing for nuclear options. Be ready for anything. Diana read the message over his shoulder. "They're getting sloppy," she observed. "Desperate people make mistakes." "Yes," Michael agreed, "but desperate people can also be dangerous. Tomorrow we're not just fighting for property rights anymore. We're fighting to save an entire community from corporate pirates who've forgotten that real people live in these homes." The pieces were in place. The truth was on their side. Tomorrow would bring the final battle for Pine Valley Estates. The Pine Valley Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. By 6 o'clock, an hour before the scheduled board meeting, the parking lot was full. Private security guards in dark suits, hired by the Hamiltons, stood at strategic points around the building. But they weren't the only ones watching. State police vehicles, called in by Marcus, maintained a visible presence nearby. Michael arrived with Diana and Sarah, noting the mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces in the growing crowd. The legitimate residents were easy to spot. They were the ones greeting neighbors, sharing concerned looks, clutching the information packets the Patels had distributed. The Hamilton plants stood apart, checking their phones, avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with their role in this scheme. "Attendance verification station is ready," Tom Watson reported, approaching with his laptop. "Every resident has to check in through our system. Multiple ID requirements, property record verification, everything cross-referenced with Linda's official database." "How are they taking it?" Michael asked, nodding toward the security guards. "Not happy," Tom grinned. "They tried to insist on using their own registration process, but Marcus shut that down fast. State investigation protocols apparently trump private security preferences." Inside the main hall, the tension was palpable. The Hamiltons had arranged the space to their advantage. Board members elevated on a stage, audience sections carefully divided, microphones controlled by their people. But they hadn't counted on the community's preparation. Sarah had arrived early with a team of volunteers, rearranging chairs into a more open format. Linda Chen had set up a public record station near the entrance, ready to challenge any suspicious property claims. The Patels had positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the room, prepared to distribute evidence of the Hamilton scheme at the crucial moment. Rebecca Hamilton arrived with her entourage, James at her side, their brother David, and the corporate legal team led by Blackwood and Torres. They faltered slightly at seeing the changed room arrangement, but quickly recovered, moving to take their positions on stage. "Mr. Sullivan," Blackwood called out as they passed, "I hope you're prepared for tonight's outcome. Some changes are inevitable." "Funny," Michael replied calmly. "I was about to say the same thing." The meeting began with Rebecca Hamilton attempting to establish control. "Due to the serious nature of recent events," she announced, "we'll be following strict procedural protocols. Only verified property owners may participate in tonight's vote." "Absolutely agreed," Diana stood up. "Which is why the state attorney general's office has mandated that all property claims must be verified through official county records before any votes are cast." A murmur ran through the crowd as Marcus stepped forward. "Furthermore, any attempt to vote using fraudulently obtained property rights will result in immediate criminal charges." The color drained from James Hamilton's face as he whispered urgently to his wife. Their plants in the audience began shifting uncomfortably, some quietly making their way toward the exits. Rebecca Hamilton's voice turned sharp. "This is a private community matter. The state has no authority." "Actually," Diana interrupted, "as this meeting involves attempts to dissolve an organization under active criminal investigation, the state has every authority. Now shall we proceed with proper verification of all attending members?" What followed was a masterclass in professional humiliation. One by one, the Hamiltons' fake homeowners were exposed. Each challenged property claim revealed another layer of their scheme. The crowd watched in growing anger as the true scope of the manipulation became clear. "These aren't just fraudulent transfers," Marcus announced, holding up evidence. "These documents show a pattern of deliberate attempt to manipulate community voting rights. Combined with the previous evidence of HOA fund mismanagement and targeted harassment, we're looking at multiple federal violations." Rebecca Hamilton's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. We built this community. Everything we've done has been to maintain standards, to protect property values, to protect your family's profits," Michael corrected, standing to address the crowd. "Let's be clear about what's really happening here. The Hamiltons haven't been protecting this community. They've been using it as their personal piggy bank, forcing out homeowners who don't fit their plans, using our HOA fees to fund their schemes, and now trying to seize even more control through fraudulent means." The legitimate residents erupted in angry agreement. Even the security guards looked uncomfortable, several stepping back from their positions as the mood in the room shifted. But James Hamilton wasn't finished. He grabbed the microphone from his wife. "You want to talk about fraud? Let's talk about how you've turned this community against itself, Sullivan. Let's talk about the real estate deals you made before retiring. Let's talk about—" "James," a quiet voice cut through his rant. Jessica Parker had stood up from her seat in the back. "Stop! It's over." The look of betrayal on James Hamilton's face spoke volumes. His assistant's presence here, the realization of her role in exposing their plans, seemed to finally break his remaining control. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled, but Marcus was already moving toward the stage with several state officers. The night was far from over, but the first battle had been decisively won. As state officers approached the stage, David Hamilton suddenly stepped forward, raising his hands for attention. "Before anyone does anything rash, there's something everyone here needs to understand." He pulled out a thick stack of documents from his briefcase. Pine Valley Estates isn't just an HOA. It's a complex web of legal entities and financial obligations. Diana's eyes narrowed as she studied the documents being distributed. "This is their nuclear option," she whispered to Michael. "Be ready." David continued, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone used to manipulating financial fears. "Our family's companies hold the underlying mortgages on nearly 40% of the properties in this community. We also control the bonds that fund all community infrastructure, roads, utilities, common areas. If this HOA is dissolved or our management is removed, all of these obligations become immediately due." A ripple of concern moved through the crowd. David pressed his advantage. That means every homeowner with a Hamilton-backed mortgage would face immediate foreclosure. The community infrastructure bonds would default, leaving residents responsible for millions in municipal debt. Is that what you want, Mr. Sullivan? To destroy your neighbors' financial lives, to win your personal vendetta? Michael felt the mood in the room shifting. Even his supporters were exchanging worried glances. The Hamiltons had played their masterstroke, using the community's own financial entanglements as a weapon against it. But before the fear could take root, Sarah Martinez stood up. "I've been analyzing the HOA's financial records for weeks," she announced, connecting her tablet to the room's projection system. "And there's something interesting about these Hamilton-backed mortgages." Charts and figures filled the screen. Every mortgage they control was originally issued by other banks. The Hamiltons' companies acquired them specifically targeting homeowners who had opposed HOA initiatives or refused to sell to Sunrise Development. Linda Chen joined in, adding her own documentation to the projection. And these infrastructure bonds, they were transferred to Hamilton Financial Services through a series of shell companies, all after Rebecca Hamilton became HOA president. Marcus stepped forward, his state investigator's badge visible. "What we're seeing here is a deliberate strategy of financial entrapment. The Hamiltons created artificial debt obligations to maintain control over the community. Under RICO statutes, that's textbook racketeering. Furthermore," Diana added, standing to address the crowd, "any contracts or financial obligations obtained through fraud are legally void. My firm has already prepared documents to challenge every Hamilton-controlled mortgage and bond, with support from the State Attorney General's office." But David Hamilton wasn't finished. He turned to face the homeowners directly. "You really want to trust your financial future to a lengthy legal battle? By the time this works its way through the courts, you could all lose everything. Or," he smiled, "we can resolve this simply. Maintain current HOA management, drop all investigations, and everything stays stable. Your choice." The room fell silent as residents wrestled with the decision. Then Tom Watson spoke up from his verification station. "You know what? I'd rather fight." He closed his laptop decisively. "These people have been stealing from us for years, threatening us, trying to force us out of our homes. I'm done being afraid of them." "So am I," Linda Chen added. "They tried to force my elderly neighbors out, used these same financial threats. Enough is enough." One by one, residents began standing, voicing their support. The Patels, who had faced targeted harassment over their cultural celebrations. The young couple who had nearly lost their home to fraudulent HOA fines. Even some of the Hamiltons, fake voters, seeing the tide turn, began slipping out of the room. Rebecca Hamilton grabbed the microphone in a final desperate attempt. "This is your last warning. If you pursue this, we'll make sure—" The mic cut off as Tom killed the sound system. Michael stepped forward to address the crowd. "The Hamiltons built their power on isolation and fear. They picked us off, one by one, made each of us feel alone in our fight. But look around, we're not alone anymore." He turned to face the Hamiltons. "You can threaten us with financial ruin. You can try to force us out of our homes. But you made one crucial mistake. You taught us that we're stronger together than you are." Marcus moved in with his officers, producing official warrants. "Rebecca, James, and David Hamilton, you're under arrest for multiple violations of federal law, including racketeering, fraud, and criminal conspiracy." As the Hamiltons were led away, Diana turned to Michael with a slight smile. "You realize this is just the beginning? Untangling their financial web, helping homeowners reclaim their properties, rebuilding the community's governance. It's going to be a long fight." Michael watched as neighbors hugged, shared contact information, and began forming committees to handle the transition. "Maybe," he replied, "but this time we're fighting it together." The days following the Hamiltons' arrest brought a whirlwind of activity to Pine Valley Estates. News vans lined the streets as reporters covered what was quickly becoming a national story about corporate corruption and community resistance. But inside Michael's living room, a different kind of revolution was taking shape. The forensic accountants have found 17 separate shell companies so far, Marcus explained to the gathered group of residents. They had converted Michael's home into a temporary command center, with different rooms dedicated to various aspects of untangling the Hamiltons' web of control, each one designed to hide their financial manipulation of the community. Sarah Martinez, now heading the Financial Recovery Committee, pulled up detailed spreadsheets on the large monitor they'd installed. We've identified over $3 million in fraudulent fines and assessments over the past 5 years, money that was funneled directly into Hamilton family enterprises. But here's the good news, Diana added, sorting through legal documents spread across Michael's dining table. The State Attorney General's office has frozen all Hamilton family assets, including their overseas accounts, thanks to Jessica's warning about their attempted transfer of funds. Jessica Parker, no longer James Hamilton's assistant, but now a key witness for the prosecution, sat quietly in the corner, still processing her role in bringing down her former employers. They really thought they were untouchable, she observed. Even after the arrests, James kept insisting that their lawyers would have them out within hours. Speaking of their lawyers, Tom Watson interjected from his laptop station, Blackwood and Torres resigned from National Community Developers this morning. Apparently, they're cooperating with investigators to avoid being charged as co-conspirators. Michael watched as his neighbors worked together, each bringing their unique skills to the recovery effort. Linda Chen had organized a team to audit every property transaction involving Sunrise Development. The Patels had turned their printing business into an information hub, producing daily updates for residents. Even those who had initially been intimidated by the Hamiltons were now stepping forward to help. We've got another issue to address, Diana announced, calling everyone's attention. The infrastructure bonds that David Hamilton threatened us with? We've discovered they were illegally transferred from municipal control. The good news is, this means they're void. The bad news? The community still needs proper infrastructure management. I might have a solution for that, Michael said, pulling out plans he'd been working on. During my development days, I specialized in community infrastructure projects. What if we created a resident-owned cooperative to manage our own infrastructure? Cut out the corporate middlemen entirely. The idea sparked immediate interest. Sarah began running financial projections, while Tom started sketching out a digital management system. The conversation flowed with energy and purpose. This wasn't just about recovering from the Hamiltons' corruption anymore. It was about building something better. There's more, Linda added, pulling up city records on her tablet. Remember all those zoning changes the Hamiltons claimed gave them authority over independent properties? Not only were they fake, but we found evidence they bribed city officials to prevent proper zoning oversight. The city council is launching its own investigation. Just then, Michael's phone rang. It was Marcus with an update from the State Attorney General's office. He put it on speaker. The Hamiltons' bail hearing just ended, Marcus reported. Given the scope of the charges and evidence of attempted asset flight, the judge denied bail. They'll remain in custody until trial. A cheer went up from the gathered residents, but Michael noticed Jessica's slight frown. What is it? He asked quietly. I worked with them for years, she replied. They're not done. James Hamilton especially. He doesn't know how to stop. Even from custody, he'll try to find a way to retaliate. Diana overheard them. She's right. We need to stay vigilant. The Hamiltons still have allies in the development world, in local government. This kind of corruption doesn't exist in isolation. Then we'll stay prepared, Michael declared, addressing the room. But here's the difference. They're not fighting isolated homeowners anymore. They're facing an entire community that's learned its own strength. Sarah stood up, excitement in her eyes. Actually, it's more than just our community now. I've been getting calls from other developments, other HOAs, people who've faced similar corruption. They want to know how we did it, how we fought back. This could be the beginning of something much bigger. Michael looked around his living room, at neighbors who had become allies and fighters who had become friends. The Hamiltons had tried to break their community through division and fear. Instead, they had united it, creating a force for change that was just beginning to realize its potential. Well then, he smiled, let's show them how it's done. Jessica's warning about James Hamilton proved prophetic sooner than anyone expected. Just a week after the arrests, the first wave of retaliation hit Pine Valley Estates. It started with a series of anonymous complaints to various regulatory agencies: Health Department, Building Inspection, Environmental Protection, all targeting homes of residents who had spoken out against the Hamiltons. It's not a coincidence, Diana explained during an emergency meeting in Michael's living room. These complaints are too coordinated, too specific. They're using their remaining connections in local government to harass the community. Tom Watson pulled up a digital map on the main screen showing the pattern of complaints. Look at this. Every target is someone who provided evidence to the investigation. The Patel's printing business was hit with a surprise health inspection. Linda's home got flagged for an emergency structural review. Even Michael's property is facing new environmental impact assessments. But here's where they miscalculated, Sarah added, bringing up her own documentation. We've been tracking every official interaction since the arrests, every inspection, every complaint, every phone call. The pattern proves targeted harassment, which violates the terms of their bail agreement. Michael studied the data. They're not just targeting individuals anymore. These complaints could shut down businesses, force expensive repairs, create real hardship for people who stood up to them. That's exactly their plan, Jessica interjected. She'd been monitoring communications from her former business contacts. They want to show other communities what happens when you challenge the system. Make an example of Pine Valley Estates. Just then, Linda burst into the room, tablet in hand. You need to see this. Someone just filed liens against 12 properties in the community, all people who testified about the Hamiltons' mortgage manipulation scheme. Diana was already on her phone. Marcus, we need the AG's office to move on this now. The Hamiltons are violating every agreement they made. But before Marcus could respond, another crisis emerged. The Patels called in a panic. City officials had just arrived to shut down their printing business over anonymous safety concerns. Similar reports started flooding in from around the community. The Hamiltons' allies were moving simultaneously. On multiple fronts, they're trying to overwhelm us, Michael realized. Hit so many targets at once that we can't respond effectively. Then we adapt, Tom declared, quickly modifying his community alert system. Everyone who's not currently dealing with inspectors form response teams. We document everything, support each targeted neighbor, and show these officials they're being used as pawns. The community mobilized with remarkable efficiency. When inspectors arrived at Linda's house, they found a team of neighbors with cameras and legal observers. The Patel's printing shop filled with customers who happened to be architects, engineers, and safety experts, all ready to challenge any spurious violations. Michael's environmental impact assessment turned into an impromptu community forum on sustainable development, with resident experts highlighting how his Mediterranean design actually improved local water conservation. This isn't what they expected, Jessica observed, watching the coordinated response. The Hamiltons always relied on isolating their targets. They've never faced an organized community before. Diana received a call from Marcus. "The AG's office is moving to revoke their bail," she announced. "This coordinated harassment campaign violates multiple conditions, but more importantly, they've just given us evidence of ongoing conspiracy. These actions prove the Hamiltons are still trying to control the community from behind bars." Sarah pulled up her financial tracking software. "And I've found something interesting about these liens. They were filed through a law firm that's represented other Hamilton enterprises. We can trace the paper trail directly back to them. But why would they be so blatant about it?" Linda wondered. "They have to know we're watching everything they do." "Because they're desperate," Michael explained. "Their entire business model depends on maintaining control through fear. If they can't crush this rebellion in Pine Valley, other communities might follow our example. They're willing to risk everything to stop that from happening." The room fell quiet as everyone absorbed this realization. Then Tom spoke up from his computer station. "Well, they picked the wrong community to make an example of. Look at this. Our documentation of their harassment campaign has gone viral. Community rights groups across the country are sharing our story. Fight corrupt HOAs is trending." Diana smiled grimly. "The Hamiltons wanted to show everyone what happens when you stand up to corrupt developers. Instead, they're showing the world that communities can fight back and win." Michael looked around at his neighbors, tired but determined, stressed but united. The Hamiltons thought they could break their spirit through bureaucratic warfare. Instead, each new attack only made the community stronger, more organized, more determined to see this fight through to the end. "All right," he addressed the group. "Let's show them what a real community looks like. Document everything, support each other, and keep exposing their tactics. They want to play hardball. Let's give them a game they'll never forget." The Hamiltons' harassment campaign backfired spectacularly, but not in the way anyone expected. As Michael sat in Diana's office reviewing the latest developments, the true scope of their victory was becoming clear. Every regulatory inspection they triggered, Diana said, spreading out reports across her desk, it created an official record. Every complaint they filed documented evidence. They didn't just fail to break the community, they handed us a paper trail proving their ongoing conspiracy. Marcus arrived with even more significant news. The judge just revoked their bail, but that's not the biggest development. He pulled out his tablet, showing emails recovered from James Hamilton's prison communications. Look who he's been coordinating with. The emails revealed connections to officials in multiple city departments, executives at other development companies, even a state-building commissioner. All part of a vast network dedicated to using regulations and bureaucracy as weapons against homeowners. "This isn't just about Pine Valley anymore," Marcus explained. "We're looking at systematic corruption across the entire region." The Hamiltons were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Sarah, who had been analyzing financial records, added her own discovery. "Remember those infrastructure bonds they used to threaten us? We found similar arrangements in 12 other communities. Same pattern: HOA takeover, financial entrapment, forced property sales." "But here's where it gets interesting," Tom interjected from his laptop. "Since our story went viral, residents from those communities have been reaching out. They've started forming their own resistance groups, documenting everything, building their own cases." Michael studied the growing evidence. "So, the Hamiltons' attempt to make an example of us has created a blueprint for fighting back," Diana finished. "Communities across 3 states are now using our methods to expose similar corruption." The office door opened as Linda Chen rushed in, excitement evident on her face. "You're not going to believe this. The city council just called an emergency session. They're launching a full investigation into development corruption. All those officials who helped the Hamiltons, they're being suspended pending review." Then Jessica arrived with another crucial piece of information. National Community Developers is cutting all ties with the Hamiltons. Their board of directors is worried about stockholder lawsuits. They're offering to cooperate with investigators. In exchange for immunity, they're turning on each other, Marcus observed with satisfaction. This is usually when we get our best evidence. Nobody wants to be the last one holding the bag. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from the Patels. Their printing shop had become a de facto information center for the growing movement, and they had news from other communities. Homeowners in Oak Ridge, another Hamilton-controlled development, had just won their first court victory. The judge had frozen their HOA's accounts, pending investigation. It's happening everywhere, Sarah said, pulling up news reports. Sacramento, Portland, Denver. Communities are standing up to corrupt developers and HOAs. They're using our documentation methods, our legal strategies, our community organization techniques. Diana smiled. The Hamiltons wanted to crush one rebellion. Instead, they sparked a revolution. But Michael noticed Jessica's concerned expression. What is it? I know these people, she said quietly. The development industry, the corrupt officials, they won't go down without a fight. They've got too much money, too much power invested in this system. Good, Michael replied firmly, because we're not just fighting for Pine Valley anymore. We're fighting for every community that's faced this kind of corruption. And this time, we're not alone. Tom's laptop pinged with new alerts. Speaking of not being alone, you need to see this. Community rights groups are organizing a national conference. They want us to share our story, teach our methods, help other neighborhoods. Fight back. And look at this, Linda added, showing her tablet. The state legislature is fast-tracking new HOA reform laws. They're using evidence from our case to close the loopholes that developers have been exploiting. Sarah pulled up her financial projections. Our resident-owned infrastructure cooperative, other communities are already adapting the model. We're creating a new template for neighborhood governance, one that puts homeowners first. Michael stood at Diana's office window, looking out at the city skyline. He thought about his Mediterranean villa, the home he'd fought so hard to protect. What started as one man's stand against HOA overreach had grown into something far more significant, a movement for community rights and corporate accountability. The Hamiltons thought they could use our community to send a message, he said. Well, they succeeded, just not the message they intended. Diana joined him at the window. They showed everyone that the system was rigged against homeowners, but more importantly, they showed everyone how to fight back. And win, Marcus added. Don't forget that part, because this fight, it's just beginning. 3 months after the Hamiltons' bail revocation, Michael stood in the federal courthouse, watching as the judge delivered the verdict that would reshape community development across the country. The trial had lasted weeks, revealing layers of corruption that stretched far beyond Pine Valley Estates. In the matter of United States versus Hamilton et al., the judge began, her voice carrying through the packed courtroom. This court finds the defendants guilty on all counts of racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, and corrupt business practices. Rebecca Hamilton's carefully maintained composure finally cracked as the judge continued listing the charges. James Hamilton stared straight ahead, his face a mask of disbelief. David Hamilton seemed to physically shrink in his expensive suit as the severity of their sentences became clear. Given the systematic nature of these crimes, the judge declared, and their devastating impact on countless families, this court sentences each defendant to 15 years in federal prison. Furthermore, all assets derived from these illegal activities are to be forfeited and placed in a restitution fund for the affected communities. Diana squeezed Michael's arm in triumph as Marcus smiled from his place with the prosecution team. But the judge wasn't finished. More importantly, she continued, this case has exposed fundamental flaws in how residential communities are governed and developed. The court is recommending federal legislation to prevent similar abuses in the future. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the Pine Valley residents who had become the faces of the community rights movement. Sarah Martinez expertly handled questions about the financial implications, while Tom Watson explained how their digital documentation methods had helped expose the corruption. "This isn't just about punishing the Hamiltons," Michael told the assembled media. "It's about transforming how communities protect themselves from corporate predators. Every homeowner deserves to feel secure in their property rights." Back in Nidid's Pine Valley Estates, the transformation was already visible. The resident-owned infrastructure cooperative had taken over community management, with transparent operations and democratic decision-making. The oppressive beige conformity demanded by the old HOA had given way to thoughtful diversity in home designs. "Look at this," Linda Chen said during the next community meeting, displaying before and after photos. "Remember when the Hamiltons tried to find the Patels for their Diwali decorations? Now we have cultural celebration guidelines that actually encourage diverse expressions of community life." The Patel's printing shop had evolved into a community resource center, helping other neighborhoods document and challenge similar corruption. Their walls were covered with news clippings and thank you letters from communities across the country who had successfully fought back against predatory developers. "We've received requests for help from 53 communities in 12 states, Tom reported, pulling up his tracking system. "Our digital platform for documenting HOA abuse has over 10,000 active users. People aren't afraid to fight back anymore." Jessica Parker, who had become a key advisor for the community rights movement, shared updates from the corporate world. National community developers' stock is still falling. Other development companies are rushing to adopt new transparency policies. The whole industry is being forced to change. But the most significant changes were happening at the local level. Michael's Mediterranean villa, once targeted for its uniqueness, had become a symbol of architectural freedom. Other homeowners began expressing their own styles, creating a vibrant tapestry of designs that actually increased property values through their distinctive character. The Hamiltons claimed uniformity-protected property values, Sarah explained, showing the latest market analysis. "But our diversity has made Pine Valley one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the region. Turns out people prefer communities with character and strong resident rights." Diana arrived with more news from the legal front. The restitution fund is being structured as a foundation to support community rights initiatives. Pine Valley residents will help oversee its distribution, ensuring the money helps other neighborhoods fight similar battles. Marcus added his own update. "The FBI has opened investigations into 3 other major development companies using the Hamilton playbook. This isn't just one victory. It's the beginning of a national cleanup." As Michael walked home that evening, he passed neighbors chatting on front porches, children playing in yards decorated to reflect their families' personalities, and community bulletin boards covered with notices for local events and mutual aid initiatives. "You know what the Hamiltons never understood," he remarked to Diana, who had joined him for the walk. "A community isn't about controlling people, it's about bringing them together, letting them build something unique." "They saw homes as assets to be manipulated," Diana agreed. "They forgot about the people who lived in them." "Well," Michael smiled, looking at his beloved villa, "I'd say the people have reminded them rather effectively." 6 months after the Hamiltons' sentencing, Michael found himself standing at a podium in the National Community Rights Conference, facing an audience of over 1,000 homeowners, activists, and legal experts from across the country. The Pine Valley story had become a blueprint for community resistance, and now others wanted to learn from their experience. "The Hamiltons didn't just control our homes," Michael began, gesturing to the presentation behind him. "They tried to control our lives through arbitrary rules, financial manipulation, and fear. But they taught us something important. When communities stand together, no corporation is too big to challenge. The conference center buzzed with energy as representatives from different neighborhoods shared their own stories of resistance and victory. Sarah Martinez led a workshop on detecting financial fraud in HOA operations, while Tom Watson demonstrated the community documentation platform that had grown from his original alert system. "Look at these numbers," Sarah said during her session, displaying nationwide data. In the past 6 months, 47 communities have successfully challenged corrupt development practices. 32 HOAs have been restructured under resident control. The movement is growing faster than we ever imagined. Linda Chen, who had been coordinating with legal teams across the country, shared updates on the legislative front. 6 states have already passed new HOA reform laws based on the Pine Valley case. 12 more have bills in progress. We're seeing real systemic change. During a break, Michael met with Jessica Parker, who had become a sought-after consultant for communities, fighting corporate developers. "National community developers' stock hasn't recovered," she reported. 3 more major development companies have completely restructured their HOA management practices. The industry is finally realizing that the old predatory model is no longer viable. The Patels had set up an information booth, sharing their experience of turning their printing shop into a community resource center. Their model had been replicated in dozens of other neighborhoods, creating a network of local hubs for organizing and information sharing. But the most important changes, Michael continued in his keynote speech, aren't in the legal victories or corporate reforms. They're in how communities see themselves. Pine Valley isn't just a collection of houses anymore. It's a living example of what happens when neighbors work together. He shared photos of their transformed community. Gardens that once faced fines for being non-standard now hosted community events. The rigid beige conformity had given way to thoughtful architectural diversity. Property values had risen not despite their differences, but because of them. Diana, who had been advising other communities on legal strategy, joined Michael on stage. The restitution fund from the Hamilton case has already helped 15 communities launch their own challenges against corrupt developers. But more importantly, it's shown people they're not alone in this fight. Marcus added updates from the ongoing investigations. The FBI's Corporate Corruption Task Force has opened inquiries into development practices in 27 cities. The Pine Valley case created a domino effect that's exposing decades of systematic abuse. During the audience Q&A, a homeowner from Seattle stood up. "Our development company uses the exact same playbook the Hamiltons used. They control our mortgages, our infrastructure bonds, everything." "How did you overcome that fear of losing everything?" Michael thought carefully. Before responding, "We realized something crucial. They only had power because we were isolated. Once we came together as a community, documented everything, and showed others what was happening, their threats lost their power. They wanted to make an example of us. Well, they succeeded, just not the way they intended." The conference concluded with the formation of the National Community Rights Alliance, a network of neighborhoods committed to fighting corporate exploitation and promoting resident-controlled development. Pine Valley's resident-owned infrastructure cooperative became a model for the Alliance's recommended governance structure. Back home that evening, Michael walked through his neighborhood, noticing how much had changed. The fear that once kept people behind closed doors had been replaced by a vibrant street life. Neighbors gathered on porches, children played in yards decorated to reflect their families' cultures, and community bulletin boards overflowed with notices for local initiatives. Tom caught up with him, tablet in hand. "You need to see this. We just got requests for help from 30 more communities. The movement's growing faster than we can keep up." "Then we'll grow with it," Michael replied, looking at his Mediterranean villa, the home that had started it all. The Hamiltons thought they could stop change by making an example of one stubborn homeowner. Instead, they sparked a revolution. In how communities fight back against corporate control, a group of visiting homeowners from another state was touring Pine Valley, taking notes and photos, learning from their experience. Michael smiled, remembering how isolated he'd felt when this fight began. Now, standing among allies from across the country, he realized the Hamiltons' greatest mistake. They had tried to break a community's spirit, but instead they had helped forge a national movement for help from 30 more communities. The movement's growing faster than we can keep up. 1 year to the day after the Hamilton sentencing, Pine Valley Estates hosted a community celebration that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Michael's Mediterranean villa, once targeted for its uniqueness, served as the perfect backdrop for an event that celebrated the neighborhood's transformation. "Remember when they tried to make me paint this place beige?" Michael joked to Diana as they watched families gather in his garden. Children played among the formerly non-compliant flower beds, while parents chatted on the patio that had once faced weekly violation notices. Sarah Martinez had set up a display chronicling their journey, complete with the original threatening, letters from the HOA, photos of the confrontations, and news coverage of their victory. "It's important to remember where we started," she explained to a group of visitors from other communities. "Sometimes you have to hit rock bottom before you can rebuild." The Patels had transformed their driveway into an outdoor cafe, serving traditional Indian dishes alongside their neighbors' contributions to the potluck. Their Diwali decorations, once deemed violations, now inspired other families to share their own cultural celebrations throughout the year. "You know what's really remarkable?" Linda Chen observed, showing Michael the latest property value reports. "Our home values have increased 40% since we got rid of the uniform design requirements. Turns out, people actually prefer neighborhoods with character and community spirit." Tom Watson had set up an interactive display showing the growth of their community documentation platform. "We've helped over 200 neighborhoods challenge corrupt developers," he explained proudly. "Every week, we get more requests for support." Jessica Parker, who now ran a consulting firm helping other communities fight corporate exploitation, shared updates from the industry side. 3 major development companies have completely abandoned the HOA control model, she reported. They're actually marketing their new communities as resident-empowered developments. The Hamiltons inadvertently changed the entire industry. As the evening progressed, Michael found himself sitting with Diana on his patio, watching the sunset. Paint the sky in colors that would have violated the old HOA's aesthetic guidelines. They observed how naturally neighbors interacted, how children played across yard boundaries that once had to conform to strict regulations, how the whole atmosphere had shifted from fear to fellowship. "You know what really got to me during the fight?" Michael confided. "It wasn't just about protecting my home. It was realizing how many people lived in fear in their own neighborhoods. The Hamiltons didn't just control properties. They controlled lives." Diana nodded, watching a group of residents planning the community's next project, a shared garden space where the Hamiltons had once planned to build more cookie-cutter houses. "That's why this victory was so important. You didn't just save your home, you showed people they could fight back." Marcus joined them, bringing news from his ongoing investigations. "The ripple effect continues," he reported. "We've uncovered similar schemes in 5 more states. But here's the difference. Communities aren't afraid anymore. They're organizing before the developers can establish control." The celebration had drawn visitors from across the country. Other homeowners, fighting their own battles, legal experts studying their methods, even former Hamilton employees who had become whistleblowers. Each brought their own stories of resistance and hope. "Tell me something," Diana said to Michael as they watched the gathering. "When you first got that HOA notice, did you ever imagine it would lead to all this?" Michael laughed, shaking his head. "I just wanted to protect my home. I never expected to help start a national movement." Sarah approached with her tablet, showing them messages from other communities. "Look at this. Remember the Seattle neighborhood from the conference? They just won their case against their development company. They used our exact strategy. And here's something interesting," Tom added, joining them. "Remember how the Hamiltons threatened us with those infrastructure bonds? 3 more communities have adopted our cooperative management model. They're completely breaking free from corporate control." As night fell, neighbors lit lanterns throughout the garden, a tradition started by the Patels that had spread throughout Pine Valley. The warm lights created a gentle glow that reflected off homes now painted in varied colors, each expressing its owner's personality while somehow creating a more harmonious whole than the old enforced uniformity ever had. "You know what the Hamiltons never understood," Michael mused, looking out over his transformed neighborhood. "True community can't be enforced through rules and threats. It grows from trust, respect, and the freedom to be different while working together." Linda joined them with a final piece of news. The state legislature just passed what they're calling the Pine Valley Act, comprehensive reform of HOA, regulations and developer oversight. Our story literally changed the law. Michael smiled, watching his neighbors, now friends and fellow fighters, enjoying the evening together. The Hamiltons had tried to break their spirit by attacking one homeowner. Instead, they had forged bonds stronger than any HOA could ever control. 18 months after their victory, Michael found himself testifying before a Senate Committee on Housing Reform. The Pine Valley case had become the catalyst for a national conversation about property rights and community governance. As he looked out over the packed hearing room, he could hardly believe how far their fight had spread. "What began as one homeowner's stand against corruption," Michael explained to the senators, "has exposed systematic abuse across the country. The Hamiltons weren't unique. They were just the first to be caught and held accountable." Diana sat beside him, ready to provide legal context, while Marcus presented evidence from dozens of similar cases the State Attorney General's office had uncovered. Sarah Martinez had prepared detailed financial analysis showing how developer-controlled HOAs had been used to manipulate property markets nationwide. "In the past year alone," Sarah testified, "we've documented over 300 cases of developers using HOA regulations to force property sales. The pattern is always the same: arbitrary rule enforcement, financial harassment, and systematic pressure on homeowners who refuse to sell." Back in Pine Valley, the transformation had continued to exceed everyone's expectations. Tom Watson had turned his community alert system into a national platform, now used by thousands of neighborhoods to document and challenge corporate overreach. "We've created something revolutionary," Tom explained during a video conference break in the hearing. "Communities can now share information in real time, warning each other about predatory practices and coordinating legal responses. The developers can't isolate and target neighborhoods anymore." The Patel's Resource Center had spawned a network of similar hubs across the country. Their model of combining local business with community organizing had proven surprisingly effective. "People trust their neighbors more than distant organizations," Mr. Patel explained to a housing rights newsletter. "When we share our stories face to face, it builds the courage to fight back." Linda Chen, now serving on a state commission for housing reform, shared surprising data about property values. Communities that broke free from corporate HOA control have seen average value increases of 35%. It turns out that authentic neighborhood character and strong resident rights are actually better for property values than enforced uniformity. Jessica Parker's consulting firm had become the go-to resource for communities fighting developer exploitation. The industry is completely transforming, she reported during her Senate testimony. Companies that used to rely on HOA manipulation are being forced to compete on actual community benefits instead of coercion. The National Community Rights Alliance, born from the Pine Valley victory, had grown into a powerful advocacy organization. Representatives from over 500 communities now coordinated strategies, shared resources, and supported each other's fights against corporate control. But the real victory, Michael continued in his testimony, isn't in the numbers or the policy changes. It's in how communities see themselves. People aren't afraid anymore. They're standing up, organizing, and taking control of their neighborhoods. During a recess in the hearings, Diana shared updates about the Hamiltons. They're still trying to appeal their convictions, she said, but their empire is completely dismantled. The restitution fund has already helped 60 communities break free from similar schemes. Marcus added his perspective from ongoing investigations. What's interesting is how many developers are voluntarily changing their practices. They see what happened to the Hamiltons and realize the old model of community control isn't sustainable anymore. The Senate committee seemed particularly interested in Pine Valley's resident-owned infrastructure cooperative. Your model challenges the assumption that communities need corporate management, one senator observed. How replicable is this approach? Michael explained how their cooperative had evolved. We discovered that when residents truly own their community infrastructure, they make better long-term decisions. Our maintenance costs are down, our services have improved, and our community engagement is at an all-time high. Sarah presented data showing how Pine Valley's success had inspired similar transformations. 37 communities have already adopted our cooperative model. Another 100 are in the process. It's becoming a new standard for neighborhood governance. The hearing room was packed with community activists, housing rights advocates, and homeowners fighting their own battles against developer control. Many had traveled across the country to support the proposed federal reforms that Pine Valley's story had inspired. Looking back, Michael reflected during his closing statement, the Hamiltons thought they could make an example of our community. They succeeded, just not in the way they intended. They showed everyone that when neighbors stand together, no corporation is powerful enough to break their spirit. After the hearing, Michael received messages from communities across the country. Each shared stories of resistance, victory, and transformation. What had started as one homeowner's refusal to be bullied had grown into a movement reshaping how Americans think about community rights and corporate power. You know what's really remarkable? Diana said as they left the Senate building. The Hamiltons spent years building their empire on fear and isolation. In trying to crush one defiant homeowner, they accidentally created something they can never destroy, a network of communities that know their own strength. 2 years after that first threatening HOA letter arrived in his mailbox, Michael stood in his Mediterranean garden, hosting a very different kind of gathering. Community leaders from across the country had come to Pine Valley Estates to celebrate the passage of the National Housing Rights Act, legislation directly inspired by their fight against the Hamiltons. Who would have thought, he mused to Diana as they watched the diverse group of activists and homeowners sharing stories on his patio, that one HOA's attempt to force me to paint my house beige would lead to federal law. The law, which provided comprehensive protections against predatory development practices and HOA abuse, had passed with surprising bipartisan support. Senators who had heard Michael's testimony had been moved not just by Pine Valley's story, but by the thousands of similar accounts that had emerged in its wake. Sarah Martinez, now heading the National Community Rights Alliance's research division, presented the latest statistics. In the 2 years since our fight began, over 500 communities have broken free from corporate HOA control. Property values in resident-governed neighborhoods are up an average of 45%. More importantly, community engagement and satisfaction have skyrocketed. Tom Watson's documentation platform had evolved into a sophisticated network, linking neighborhoods across the country. "We're not just sharing information anymore," he explained to the gathered leaders. "We're creating a new model of community governance based on transparency and actual resident control." The Patel's Resource Center model had been replicated in over 200 communities. "Every neighborhood needs a heart," Mrs. Patel explained, "a place where people can gather, share information, and support each other's fights. The developers tried to isolate us. We succeeded by bringing people together." Linda Chen, fresh from her appointment to a federal housing reform commission, shared an unexpected development. "Remember those property value threats the Hamiltons used to make? Studies now show that diverse, resident-controlled communities actually attract more buyers and maintain better long-term value than corporate-managed developments." Jessica Parker's consulting firm had expanded to help communities transition from corporate to resident control. "The industry has completely shifted," she reported. "Developers are marketing resident empowerment as a selling point. The Hamilton model of control and conformity is dead." Marcus brought updates from the legal front. "The Hamiltons' appeal was denied last week," he announced to Cheers. "More importantly, their case has become a template for prosecuting similar schemes. We've secured convictions against 3 more development companies using their tactics." The gathering had drawn media attention, with reporters interested in how a local property rights dispute had sparked national change. Michael found himself explaining yet again how it all began. "The Hamiltons thought they could break us through. Isolation and fear," he told a housing rights podcast, "but every threat they made, every pressure they applied, just brought our community closer together. They didn't understand that real neighborhood value comes from people, not rules." Diana, who now led a legal advocacy network for community rights, reflected on how far they'd come. "The genius of Pine Valley's resistance wasn't just in winning the legal battle," she explained. "It was in showing other communities that they didn't have to accept corporate control as inevitable." As evening fell, the guests gathered in Michael's garden for a ceremony that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Representatives from newly liberated communities shared stories of their own victories, each one building on Pine Valley's example. "We face the same threats," a homeowner from Oregon explained, "the same pressure to conform, the same financial harassment. But because of Pine Valley, we knew we could fight back and win." Looking out over his property, the distinctive architecture that had started it all, the gardens that had once faced daily fines, the gathering space that had become a symbol of community resistance, Michael felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "The Hamiltons wanted to make an example of me," he told the assembled group. "They wanted to show what happens to homeowners who refuse to submit to corporate control. Well, they succeeded beyond their wildest nightmares. They showed everyone that resistance isn't just possible, it's contagious." As the celebration continued into the night, with lanterns glowing in gardens that now reflected every culture in the community, Michael realized something profound. The Hamiltons hadn't just failed to break Pine Valley's spirit. They had accidentally created something far more powerful than their control could ever be, a nationwide movement of communities that knew their own strength. "You know what really defeated them?" he said to Diana as they watched neighbors from across the country sharing strategies and support. "Not just our legal victory or the evidence we gathered. It was the moment people stopped being afraid, when they realized that together we're stronger than any corporation. The Mediterranean villa still stood out in Pine Valley Estates, but now it stood as something different, not just one homeowner's declaration of independence, but a symbol of every community's right to shape its own character. The Hamiltons had tried to enforce conformity through fear. Instead, they had inspired a revolution of neighbors standing together, proving that true community power grows not from control, but from freedom and mutual support. They wanted war, Michael reflected, watching the next generation of community, leaders sharing their stories. Instead, they sparked a revolution, one neighborhood at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.